Just so you know, I didn't practice this one at all.
Uh-oh. Don't say that. Everybody's listening. We
That's
won't let
fine.
the secret out. Welcome, everyone. Getting everybody joining in. So give us just a few more minutes and everybody will be joining and we'll get started. Should have had you play a little music.
Oh, well, I didn't want to bore everybody to death right from the start.
More and more people joining in. All right, give it just another minute or two.
Sure.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We know they'll have a few more people join us this evening. Thank you for all of you who have currently joined us. This is Evolution of the Legend, the Kenworth K100 Part 2. So David's going to cover, I think, quite a bit of material tonight. See how we get it all smushed in there. And I'm happy to say this one is brought to us by the Murray Hoffman Company. So thank you, MHC, for sponsoring this webinar. For those of you who have joined us before, you guys know this. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get them asked. If you're having issues or trouble or just want to send David or I a message, just put that in the chat box. And with that, I do have a couple little things. You know me, I like my polls. It's just kind of fun. Get you guys woken up, making sure you're paying attention. So tonight we're just going to do a fun little, this one's for fun. It's just nothing too stressful. Just a couple of questions. So I am going to launch this poll. And David, you should be able to see these this time.
Okay.
So how old were you when you first fell in love with trucks? And who has influenced your love of old trucks the most? Wait just a couple more minutes, or a couple more seconds, I guess. Not minutes. Don't wait that long. People are voting. This is interesting. All right. Looks like we got most everybody. So it looks like we got to get them young, David.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. If you see that, 5 to 10 years old they were when they fell in love with trucks.
start
You don't remember a time you didn't.
putting things in
Eh,
cereal boxes.
I know. And it's your parents, hey. So just something kind of fun. All right, David, it's all yours if you'd like to take the screen share away from me.
All right, let's see. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're back for part 2. Thank you for joining us again. And I was just talking to Leanne that last week we managed to spend an hour covering about 5 years, and tonight I'm going to try to cram about 15 years into the same 3-hour tour. So I'm going to hit some high spots and move on. But as I was saying last week, for even more fun, check out the July-August 2018 issue of Wheels of Time. And that's the whole article, a lot more details in there than what we can cover tonight. But it should be pretty fun. So with all that said, let's get started. If you were here last week, or weren't, here's a real quick recap. Last week we covered the K100 development from 1963 to 67. That was about the first generation cab, which was essentially an updated 500 series, 800 series cab. The big deal with it was the new tapered rail chassis. So that was from 63 to 67. In May of 1967, we got an all new cab. That's mostly what we're going to be talking about tonight. This was designed in the Kansas City plant. For a little while, it continued to use the tapered rail chassis as well. Again, we're not really covering K100E models or non-US produced trucks. Maybe at another time, but just not enough room here. I thought it was worth going over again about the model years just real quickly. Prior to 1974, there really weren't any, but after that point, we start to see financial institutions and different states requiring a model year. I mention this again only because we're bridging that line, and I'm going to start referring to certain changes by year, but it doesn't have so much to do with the year of the truck as much as it might a regulation, whether it's a federal motor carrier regulation or a DOT regulation, start to impact the look of things, safety equipment and whatnot. So there are certain things that we can say for sure happened in certain years, but just real quickly mentioning it again for those that maybe weren't here last week. So in May of 67, the Kansas City plant, or actually before May of 67, conducted a study. They like to number things. This one was called project number 735. And the way they described it, it was a project to see how it could build cabs, reducing weight and easier maintenance and whatnot. It resulted in the cab I think most of us are probably most familiar with, and the biggest deal with it was a use of a lot of fiberglass. Don't know if that was really the best idea or not, but it is what it is. So we got an all new cab rather than an updated cab. We got a completely brand new cab, clean sheet design. Fiberglass was used for the front fenders. It was used for the engine cover or doghouse if you prefer. Lots of little parts. The windshield mask became fiberglass, battery box cover. The key thing to remember about the K100B model, at first, it kept the tapered rail chassis. This is what confuses some people when they see this cab. They assume it's a K100C model. So there were, like we talked about last week, the chassis and the cabs were actually developed somewhat independently of each other. So they were still stuck on the idea of V8 engines. That's what the point of the tapered rail chassis was. And then it was time to update the cab. So it's also worth mentioning that a lot of this, well, actually all of this occurred in the Kansas City plant. I mentioned last week how the plants operated somewhat independently of each other. And a lot of what we know as the K100 look and model happened in the Kansas City plant. So we'll learn a little bit more about that as we go along. Both of these pictures were taken outside of the Kansas City plant. It seemed that at this time, they started to sort of step up their game a little bit with the paint department. We started to see fancier versions of paint designs that had been around for a little while yet, but they were really sort of promoting, I think, the fancy paint jobs at this time. A little harder. Again, you'll notice that the cutout in the bumper I talked about last week for the drag link, it's still there on the right-hand side or on the steer side, whichever it might be. This will remain a feature right up until the replacement of this chassis, which doesn't take too long. One of the things they were focusing on with the cab was sort of making it a little bit easier to get in and out of it. The new fenders had molded in steps. We were still using almost exclusively cab mounted exhausts and intakes. There were exceptions to that, but that was sort of the order of the day. For reasons I've never quite understood, the luggage box access door or storage door, whatever you want to call it, actually shrank in size and became more vertically oriented. It was rather square before. You can't get a whole lot in that little door, sort of strange. And interestingly enough, that same door did double duty. They used it on the new W900 sleepers as well. It turned it the other way around. Didn't know that for a long time, but kind of an interesting way to make the most out of the tooling that they had to purchase for it. You'll notice below the door, we see what was formerly the grill emblem. That's moved down below the door near the footstep. I'll get to grill emblems in a second. And getting in and out of the cabs, even with the footstep, was still a chore. The little grab rail there at the top didn't help a lot. I think myself included, a lot of us have done 180s trying to get out of these trucks. Not fun. The big deal with this cab, again, was fiberglass, and more fiberglass. The cab structure changed, the way they built it. The side panels and rear panel became basically prefabricated. The whole thing was built around this flimsy fiberglass doghouse. I've heard it said it wasn't meant to be a structural part of the cab, but without it, it's just a big hole in the floor. It's very thin, and it's very difficult to find a truck that doesn't have a broken doghouse in one place or another. When they started lengthening the cab later, they did almost nothing to improve it. They did almost nothing to structurally beef it up. There were a few little things, but basically it's the Achilles heel of these cabs. As much as I love them, it's sort of funky. If you remember from last week, the grill was attached to a removable panel on the first generation cabs. They did away with that, more of a conventional way of mounting it directly to the outside sheet metal. The front fenders were now fiberglass, and that probably was an improvement in a way because they were pretty easy to replace if you would damage one. The drawback to that was there were a lot of complaints about fiberglass heating up and warping, and headlights pointing towards the sky and all kinds of stuff like that. They had an interestingly unique green gel coat that they used. These parts were actually made in Kansas City. Hempco was the name of the company, the fiberglass company they used. When they opened the Chillicothe plant, they also had a different fiberglass supplier, but everything made prior to about 1974 will be this green gel coat. Just real quickly, right there below the windshield mask, you have the radiator filled door, and beside the grill, the oil access door and the fresh air intake. That didn't change dramatically from the first generation cabs, other than the fact that all that came off of the truck, with the exception of the oil filler. The fiberglass continued into the cab. It was not well thought of. Overdrive magazine tested an early truck and didn't say a lot of nice things about it. I like this dash that we're looking at. I call it a pod dash, sort of a first generation dash that didn't last too long. I like it. I know people don't like it, but I think it's kind of cool. But again, it's fiberglass, and they never really change back. The dashes stay fiberglass. You see the doghouse has those sort of ribs on the top of it. Those are very uncomfortable unless it has a pad on it, and that was still optional. Just as a point of interest, you notice the KW logo molded into it. This same doghouse molding form that they used continued straight through to the end of K100E production. So even though the logo would change corporately, that logo remained the same even on E models. So if you pull the cover up, that's what you'll see. The early interiors were an improvement over the 500 and 800 series cabs. It was sort of a period of much experimentation. I lost track of the number of different headliners. They tended to be of sort of a molded foam variety. They were different if it had air conditioning or didn't, as you can see in the picture here on the far left. The center dash changed very quickly. We'll see in a minute. Splendor panels were brought forward again from the first generation cab, but now they get vertical pleats instead of just being sort of more flat stitched panels without much going on. And the truck, if you didn't get Splendor, like in the sleeper compartment you see there, it was just sort of a hardboard that they painted whatever interior sheet metal color was. And the truck there at the bottom, it sort of illustrates how you could have gotten the Splendor panels for the doors without splurging for the one on the doghouse. And I'm sure that was a pretty uncomfortable experience for anybody trying to get into the sleeper. Pretty quickly, and this follows in with what I was saying a minute ago about regulations. Pretty quickly, in 1968, they sort of refreshed the front of the truck because of a DOT regulation regarding side clearance lamps, and so they had to remold the fiberglass fenders to include that little lamp on the corner. The grille design is finalized at this point. There were a couple of different versions. I think there's a slide coming up in a minute. Bug emblems show up in this period, but not exclusively. We'll get to that in a second. Three-piece roof design continues, and this will continue all the way up until about late 74, 75, when they finally have a one-piece roof molding. Again, the drag link cut out in the bumper. This particular truck has a chromed steel bumper, square bumpers being, or rectangular being all that was offered in this era. The grills, like the early first gen trucks, were in a state of flux for a year or so. It's kind of confusing, but in 1967 and maybe early 1968, you can find a K100B model with either a bug emblem or, as the truck in the bottom left corner, has the older fender script emblem. I don't know the rhyme or reason behind this, but they're completely different grills. The one that the bug emblem is on there in the picture is a stamped steel and chrome plated affair that's actually multiple pieces. It's taller. The emblem itself is unlike any later emblems. They're not interchangeable. It's completely flat. It doesn't wrap around the shell itself. I don't know what the deal with this was, but it didn't seem to last very long. In fact, it lasted only about a year. So you can find either one of these grills on a very early B model. Continuing with the grills is an interesting subject that creates a lot of confusion, I think. Up to this point, the grills were a certain dimension. I forget what it is, I think 34 inches. But the largest radiator was a 1,200 square inch radiator. In roughly 1975, they made available a 1,360 square inch radiator. That radiator option necessitated a wider grill. So what it gets confusing. People think the wider grill took over from the narrower grill, but it didn't at all. Both grills were available clean through all K100C production. It depended on what engine you ordered. The larger horsepower engines required 1360 square inch radiator, and if you can read that sheet, you can come back and read it. It tells you which engines, KT engines, and I think 8V engines as well. But it was a package. If you ordered the higher horsepower engine, it required the wider grill. And the wider grill sort of, set into place a couple of other things, one of which was the oil filler door got relocated. And it wasn't a standalone item is what I'm trying to get at. It was tied to the engines. What's interesting is this sort of happened around about the time of the VIT 200 bicentennial, which we'll get to in a few minutes. And technically, those trucks didn't all have engines that would require the wider grill, but they all used the wider grill because they all had air conditioning. And there wasn't really a way to put a rooftop air conditioner up on top of the bicentennial, the elevated roof already. And they all came with air conditioning as standard. And so they needed the wider grill denser unit, which is the air conditioning condenser unit. So that's kind of an interesting anomaly, but essentially, I hope that explains the grills. Both grills were available all the way through production, and the wider grill was tied to the 1360 radiator. So in April of '69, we get the K100C. They finally abandoned the idea that V8 engines are going to take over the world, and they go back to a straight rail section frame. So you could sort of consider the metamorphosis complete. We now have a new cab, and we have basically, a very old style frame, but it's a straight rail frame. This will remain unchanged all the way through the end of K100E production. The cab will change, but this particular setup, they're done at this point, basically. And what happens from this point on is just basically a lot of development of the cab and features and things like that. But the structure of the truck remains this way from here on out. Once again, for about the fifth time, we get new castings on the front of the frame, which are what holds the spring and the cab tilt and everything else. So again, the bumper bolt pattern changes again. You can really sort of date the trucks or identify the trucks by the bumper bolt patterns. So for the first time, we don't need a cutout for the drag link because the steering box has been raised up. So from here on out, if you see square cutouts, they're there as steps rather than because they need to be there. So K100C production begins approximately in the chassis range of about 208, 890, according to build records. So roughly April, mid-April, late April 1969. Fairly quickly, they redesigned the dash and get rid of the pod that I actually like. These are all fiberglass. All these dash sections were fiberglass. The earlier style pod dash could have one of two different center sections. And then we get the revised flat panel, small flat panel section, and it gets another updated center section, which you see there on the color photo. And that's the way things stay for some trucks all the way through production. Aerodynes and VIT 200s will get different dashes, but this is sort of the standard dash all the way through. Gauges are still Stewart Warner, but about mid-74, they become quote unquote bi-torque gauges. There were lots of other gauges available, Motorola and Dixon, and lots of options. I put the clock in there because I have one. I think it's cool. And I'm still trying to figure out how they mounted that. But there were lots of different gauges available. But this dash design remains in place straight through to K100E production on certain models. The door up to this point had sort of been both a strong point and a weak point. It was a strong point in the sense that it was pretty sturdy. It's built from a single extrusion with a welded panel, but the latching system and the inner panel system was not very stout. The door handle was mounted up high. You needed to have, very long arms or be very tall to reach it from the ground. And minus any decent grab rails, getting in and out was pretty tricky. So they redesigned the door with a new latching system, and at the same time threw everything else away and completely beefed it up. They added a cast aluminum brace / hand pull from the inside, which significantly stiffened the door. At the same time, the glass shrunk, the glass grew and the vent windows shrunk, give you a little more elbow room. And these doors went into production approximately December 17th, 1971. So right at the end of the year. The photo on the far left, I like because it highlights the fact that when they assembled these cabs and painted them, they did so with the latches already in place and the vent windows in place. So for you restorers out there, there are other ways to do it, but that's how you did it. If you pulled the door handle off of an original truck that's never been off of, there won't be any paint underneath of it. Interiors continue to evolve. The Splendor panels that we were talking about before, they continue fairly unchanged for a little while. Autumn Smoke is still available. In 1972, they added a fourth color, cactus green or KW green, whichever you prefer. And you could still order all these pieces either separately, door pads by themselves or sleeper panels, whatever you like, or you could order it all as a kit. There were several periods in which they had overstock of these certain colors, and they would offer a smoke and deal to dealers on packages and stuff. So they really spruced up the inside of the truck pretty nicely. After 1974, things changed a bit. They deleted the 4 colors that had been used up to that point, added 8 new colors. The vinyl material changed, and a lot of them had this sort of mottled appearance to it as opposed to just solid. They would revise all this again in 1982, and we'd get all kinds of new colors and textures once again. Headliners continued to evolve up to about 1974. They were this molded foam, as I was mentioning. Then they started in on the plastics. They had an ABS. It was an ABS type plastic they called it Cyclac. I don't really know what that means, but it's an ABS plastic. I've actually had pieces of it tested, and it was great for a little while. And then, like most ABS plastics, it cracks and it becomes a problem. So headliners were kind of always really not very durable in these trucks. And you don't see a lot of restored trucks, people replace them with other things. Fuel tanks, we have some changes because of regulations. Just to recap, again, the 63 to 67 was more or less just a raised welded tube. In 67, 68, we got a cast version of a raised tube with a cast base associated with it. Sometime in 68, we get an inverted cast neck with a thermos type cap on it. These are kind of cool. They're very identifiable. And then in 1973, you can't see it because I think I'm in the way. At least I am on my computer. We get a recessed version of that, which everybody seems to have hated because it collected snow and all kinds of junk falling into the tank. And then they finally abandoned that in roughly, I think, late 77, early 78 for what we see today, still sort of a modern flush mounted cap. So if tanks are original to the truck and you're looking at a picture, they can definitely date it within a very narrow time frame, or at least up to 1978. After that, you're on your own. One of the things that they were working on was trying to get you in and out of the truck. As I said before, sometime in 68 or early 69, they came out with what they referred to as a cab access package. This is an interesting contraption. It looks a lot like steps that Freightliner had on one of their cabs at the time, but you could sort of see where they were going with it. Ironically, this was very short-lived, maybe a year or a year and a half at the most. And this, if you've ever seen a model kit, an AMT model kit for K100, this is the truck picture. This is the picture that they copied or saw, and so they copied that step. It's very strange. That they updated it finally. They introduced a sort of one-piece twin rail system, all sort of welded together. It seems to have arrived just in time for the big cab VIT, which we'll get to in a minute. So it was advertised at least as being a part of that package. I'm not sure how much sooner it showed up than that. There was a single rail, I call it a J step, that was sort of an offshoot of this. You see those all the way up through to E-model production as well. So all of this is helping, but again, it's not that easy to get in and out. In 1973, Kenworth celebrated its 50th anniversary, and to do so, they gold-plated emblems. That was kind of the long and short of it. Other than these foil decals and stationery that they attached to anything that would sit still. But they didn't just gold plate the emblems, they updated the font. And so there's a corporate change from the old crooked letter, whatever you want to call it, to the block letter. The gold version of that in 1973 was the very first time you see that. After 1973, they kept the font, but they became chrome plated or polished aluminum, as the case may be. And the fender emblem stayed with that design as well. There's been a lot of talk about the gold plating. My truck is actually a 73, and I've gotten a hold of a few different emblems over the years and sent a couple out. They were they all came back as being brass plated according to the platers. I don't doubt that there were some that were plated with gold, but I haven't seen one. Most of the original ones I see are almost black, tarnished, and gold obviously wouldn't do that. But either way, they were gold. I had mine brass plated. And it's a 1 year only thing for the 73. You really can't find these things. They're pretty hard to come by. Intakes and exhausts are, constant state amorphous. We're getting into the era where they're getting away from the cab mounted exhausts and intakes and freestanding or mounted on standards becomes more of a common choice for people. It's not really standard, I don't think, until roughly 1971 or 72. And they had a couple of different, iterations of it before they sort of landed on the last one, which allowed them to nestle the tank step into the standard channel as well. And exhaust shields, muffler shields become more popular because mufflers become more required to meet noise restrictions. It's interesting to note that the perforated shields were available either in aluminum, chrome plated, or what they refer to as high polish chrome. So they're hard to find as well, in good shape. I mentioned 12 V71s because as it relates to intakes and exhausts, they're easy to spot because they're the only engine that required dual intakes. And this was due to the two-stroke nature of the 12V and the blower. And it just simply needed more air volume than you could get through a single air cleaner and air intake. Now, people add, extra air intakes all the time, but this was the only truck that engineering would specify with the dual cleaner during this era. And they also were fitted with 4-inch exhaust instead of 5. So now we're going to talk about the other major Kansas City contribution, which was the quote unquote VIT truck, the big sleeper. And the background is actually a pretty nifty piece of crepe paper that was on the inside of this brochure here. So again, the plants operated independently to some degree. The manager of the Kansas City plant was a fellow by the name of Bill Gross. I don't know why he did this, but he took it upon himself to spearhead basically creating a double bunk extended cab K100. There's a letter in the middle of the page here that's written. It's part of a minutes meeting by one of the engineering vice presidents, John Bowden. And you see here, he's saying that all of the dealers that you might want to check out Bill Gross's new cab that he's come up with. So this clearly happened at the Kansas City plant, probably without a lot of input from Seattle. But the result of it is the largest sleeper cab COE model on the market at the time. They were very unique. They were very handmade. We'll get into some of the details here. The flyer on the left, the white truck there, it was probably built on an existing chassis. And I'll tell you why in a second, because we can't find it. So the price for all of this in late 1971 was only $1,250. And there at the right, you'll see chassis number 216752. This truck is very interesting to me because first, it was the very first of the VITs that was ever delivered. And it was delivered to Truck Enterprises in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and operated out of Lynchburg, Virginia. It would be a truck that I would like to find. I actually grew up in Virginia, and my both my parents were from Lynchburg, and I like to think that as a little kid sitting in my grandmother's store, I could have seen this truck going up down the highway. I don't think I did, and I certainly don't remember it, but I'd sure like to find it. Again, these trucks were very unique and sort of very special at first. The production began, they started taking orders early to mid 1971, but they didn't really get around to building them until that summer. Only about 7 or 8 got built before the end of the year. And if you remember from a few minutes ago, what happened at the end of 1971 is that the door got redesigned and we got low mount door handles. So only about 7 or 8 of these trucks got built with the old style high mount door handles. And if you want to come back and look at it at some other point, I've listed those trucks for you. This information is straight off of the Microfiche factory build records. So kind of interesting, just putting it out there for anybody that wants to take a look later. The interiors were incredibly interesting to me. It was the Wild West. The trucks were built in Kansas City, as I said, but the interiors were being done in Seattle. At the time, Seattle still had an upholstery shop in-house. And the idea originally was, they wanted customers to think these trucks were very special. So look through the catalog, pick whatever you like, we'll get it done for you. Keep in mind, they had contracted out other interiors long before. So they had a way of, doing that, but they wanted to do these in-house. So you end up seeing some really interesting color combinations that are very unique. They offered one of 3 different patterns on the original VITs. You could get the vertical pleats like the Splendors. You could get diamond tufts, or you could get square tufts. This went on right up until about January of 73 or so. They eliminated that. But you see the variation here in these panels. It's pretty interesting. So finding one of these is pretty neat. A concession to the fact that these early VITs were sort of built on a budget and without a lot of tooling. They had to cobble together 2 side panels to make one. They probably didn't, Bill Gross probably didn't know if this thing was going to take off or not. So this was an expedient way to do it. And I've sort of laid out this little diagram to show you that. What they did was they took an 86-inch sleeper side and simply slid it back 22 inches, cut up another one, and made a filler piece out of it because it hooks around the door frame. But if you've ever wondered why the luggage door is back where it is, or why the sleeper vent is back where it is, this is exactly where it is on an 86-inch side panel. It's just moved back. This lasted up through, the latest truck I can confirm up to this point is about mid 1973. You see on the picture on the left, you can see the seam there. There's a double row of rivets, and the truck on the right with the diagram, you can see there's only a single row of rivets just to the left of the grab rail. So pretty interesting how they made do with what they had to get it done, but pretty interesting to see that. So along those lines of trying to figure out, how to make cabs more comfortable and give customers more for their money, I talked to John Bowden a couple of years ago and asked him about the Aerodyne. His answer was that he had spent a lot of time down at the Kenworth plant, had seen a lot of their cabs sort of modified with raised roofs so they could get 2 bunks in them. Came back to Seattle, mentioned it to the engineers. They said, sure, we can do that. So with that directive, the Seattle team of engineers, Gary Zabelli, Wayne Simmons, and Larry Orr, built a prototype, a one-off prototype. I wish I was there. I'm not sure what they were thinking, but it's kind of interesting. At the end of it, they published sort of, I guess, an instructional or teaching document for the Society of American Engineers, and published it. And I was lucky enough to find a copy of that. I'm going to show you a little bit about what was in it. So you see these drawings at the top left. I don't know who drew those, but they were kind of interesting. So if you ever wonder why it looks the way it does, there's your answer. They decided for some reason to sort of raise the whole floor up, raise the whole thing up instead of raising the roof so much. But they got two bunks in there, but that bunk, the upper bunk floor is pretty down low. So you can see how it might not have been the easiest thing to get into. They made this required them to make a lot of changes. It wasn't very simple. The radiator had to grow, the tilt brackets had to grow, the shifter had to grow, everything had to grow. The thing that I find the most interesting about this truck is that it was built in late 1973 or early 1974, and there's a gull-wing bumper on it, which we'll get to, but it shouldn't be there. This predates any other sightings of a gull-wing bumper. So I'm still keen to figure out where that came from. And the license plate on it has a manufacturer's date of 1974 on it. So this isn't a later picture. Some of the details we were just talking about with the cab, it seems to have been built on an existing cab that they sort of tore apart and rebuilt. The structure of it, I find fascinating, how they had to change everything rather than what they would eventually do with the VIT 200 is just simply raise the roof. On this one, they didn't raise the roof so much as they lowered the floor. And again, that caused a lot of changes to everything. The shift tower had to grow by almost a foot. So there's a lot of engineering. It was clearly an engineering exercise as much as anything. And sorry, I didn't mean to hit that button so fast. But the gull-wing bumper that I was just talking about is an interesting story. There are a couple of factory service bulletins or marketing bulletins here. What they claim is that the gull-wing bumper sort of grew out of the television show Moving On. There's no indication as to why they did this, but they hand fabricated a couple of gull-wing bumpers for the trucks that were used on that show. And who knows why? I mean, clearly they had already done so for the Aerodyne prototype, but apparently it was just for the show. But they received so much interest in it from customers wanting to know where to buy it. I mean, this shows you how you shouldn't put something on television if it's not for sale. So, they quickly decided, hey, we need to get this thing into production. There were a lot of delays. There are a couple of different, bulletins about, we think it'll be out, production problems, we think it'll be out, so on and so forth. So it seems that it basically finally hit the streets towards the very end of 1975, just in time essentially for the VIT 200. But kind of interesting how they were influenced so much by public demand, but got to sell it. Which sort of morphs into the VIT 200 on the heels of the raised roof prototype. I guess it was deemed that there was sufficient demand for such a thing. The country went bananas over celebrating the bicentennial year, and everybody had a product or something, bicentennial related. So I couldn't quite figure out why they chose this model for the bicentennial, but they completely restyled it. They took what they learned with the prototype and basically put it into a production version. There are a lot of theories about how many of these were built, one for each dealer, or 50 for whatever states and whatnot. None of that's true. They were prepared to build 100 of each, but they sent out letters to dealers requiring pre-orders. They did not build any trucks that weren't pre-ordered. So as it turns out, they built a total of 85 of the cab-over versions and I think 43 or 46 of the conventionals. They were harder to sell in this era with the longer wheelbase. But they did a lot of promotion of this thing. The idea was that they would all be be built in the first part of the year, and they would all be on dealer showroom floors by the July 4th celebration. There was even a record and a song to go along with it, in case you couldn't get enough. There was a massive press kit offered on it. There were special mud flaps, engine plaques, all kinds of goodies. They had a graphics package. They were all painted exactly the same like this. They all had gold chassis. And there were limited options, limited engine and drivetrain options. This was to essentially make sure they had everything on hand at one time, because they were built in groups. They were built in actually two groups. One built most of the trucks, and then I think the second group was far less. But they were built as a couple of batches instead of singularly. The raised roof gave you enough room to stand up in. The bunks, were much further spaced apart than the prototype was, and this truck would later go into full production. Other special interesting things about them was we got a new dash. This would not be used on any other models until the Aerodyne came along. But the upholstery was unique. The paint was unique. Everything was kind of red, white, and blue. They had a very unique sort of brown mottled wood grain stuff on the cabinets instead of the dark walnut, and even special order forms and little plaques. So this was very popular at the time. They really joined in on the celebration. Most seem to have black steering wheels for some reason. And they were deemed popular enough to eventually go into production. They did some redesigning on the vista window area to actually let you see out of them instead of hit your head on the little shelf they put up there before. But they seem to go into production sometime in '77. They changed the name to the Aerodyne. It was an add-on to the VIT option. Would cost you about $8,200 in 1980. That was pretty expensive. So to appeal more to fleets and the more budget conscious, they did the same conversion to the 86-inch cab in 1978. These did not have the big dash. They were not available with VIT interior packages. And they ran just about $3,000 more, so a lot more affordable. And you actually see a lot of these. K100s were used for all kinds of special applications. They got on the bandwagon again with the turbine concept. They built several turbine-powered trucks in Seattle, and I believe in Canada as well. There are at least 2 or 3 of them known from not Seattle, but Kansas City. I think they were later converted to diesel power, and I think one of the trucks ended up in a museum. But there were a number of different limited editions and strange applications. Kenworth, like I think I mentioned last time, we're not shy about trying to find ways to sell you a truck. And we got things like the Gold Nugget edition, which, is nifty, but really sort of amounts to paint and upholstery. But more interesting variations we see K100 setback, K100C setback axle prototype there behind the Seattle factory. Don't know if this went into full production or not. Setback axle is something you more associate with K100E models. but they stuck K100 cabs on top of all kinds of things, chassis for dump bodies and oil field trucks, and there were 4-door versions that were used for doing all kinds of testing. So you see all kinds of fun and interesting, strange applications of what they could stick a K100 cab on top of. I thought it would be interesting for a minute to just take a quick look at some photos that Don Kempton was kind enough to share with me of early days at the Chillicothe plant. You can study these later at your leisure, but it's fascinating to me to see how they were building these trucks and see, you know, trucks moving through paint booths, and just, you know, you can totally geek out on this stuff. And it's just fascinating to, you know, especially the picture at the bottom left corner where is, I believe, what was called cab trim. And you can see there's no assembly line at this point. There's just cabs being rolled around on the floor, which just, boy, wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall there? And staging areas, and anyways, you can come back and look at this later on your own. But just across the street from the Chillicothe plant, they opened a division of Accurate Plastics. I mentioned this earlier. So they had their own supplier of fiberglass parts, and Kansas City had their own supplier. So you see variations in all kinds of things, and that's why the trucks weren't built with the same parts in the same places. You know, they were built to a blueprint essentially, but you had different pieces being used. And I wanted to just give you a real quick glimpse at some pricing over the years and how things changed a little bit. And you can come back again and take a look at this. But it also gives you a sense of when they changed pricing as well. They didn't always do it at the beginning of the year. And these are base prices. And the background picture there is interesting if you can see it well enough. It's the Kansas City back lot, and it's kind of a neat picture of some trucks sitting out there without wheels on tires on them because of tire shortages. So again, as a resource, I called from the article some selected running changes, which you can come back and peruse. And on the right is sort of a handy chart that'll help you make sense of, you know, how to identify these things from bumpers. It's once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple, and it's a quick way to know kind of what you're looking at. So that's it. I appreciate everybody's spending their evening with us again tonight, and I hope it's been interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to holler at Leanne or me, and see you down the road.
Thank you, David. That was great. Yeah, we had, you know, of course, we have the question from last time of what motor was in the moving on truck.
Well, the moving on truck was a conventional.
There we go.
But I could answer it if you want, but that's not a K100.
If you want to.
Those trucks had either a Cummins or a V903 Cummins. You know, there were a couple of different trucks used for the show.
Awesome.
So either an 855 or a V903, VT903.
Well, James Schrader said you had a picture of his truck in there, the VIT 200. So he was
That is true. That is true. Thank you, James.
He was very excited to see it. All right, we have a couple of questions here. Any information for truck parts for the VIT 200?
Parts for them?
Mm-hmm.
It would depend on the part.
Okay.
I mean, if you're talking, you know, drivetrain and whatnot, that's different than interior. There's almost nothing really being offered by Kenworth or anything like that. The trim and stuff like that, you can forget about.
Cab parts, he said.
What kind of parts?
Cab parts.
Sheet metal, interior. What are we talking?
Here, I'm going to let James, I'm going to let you talk. You guys can. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask now, James, if you can do that. Go ahead. Ready, James?
Camera shy.
All right, James is having some problems there. While we wait on him, how did you get the mattress into the 108 BBC?
You just folded it up, basically. I mean, there were different types of mattresses, but you could fold in. There were inner spring mattresses as well as foam core mattresses, but you can fold them up pretty easily.
Guess they were a little more.
The Aerodyne folding bunk mattress actually had a two-piece mattress that folded in half when you tilted the bunk up, but that you're not asking about that. You want to know how to get it in and out of the truck. You just fold it up, take the windshield out, and throw it in.
All right, I never thought about that. Thanks, Mark.
That's one way to get it out. I don't know.
James, have you got yours yet? All right. Gary wanted to know, what drivetrain does your K100 have?
Good question. It originally had an 8V71 turbo, which I took out, and I've replaced it with a early Big Cam 2. It's got an RTO 9513 13 speed and SQHDs with the 411 rear.
Awesome. Well, lots of people have said thank you. Great presentation and very informative. If anybody has any last minute questions, just throw them up there. James, if you can finish up your questions. Yeah, interior parts is what he was looking for.
There's very little available for any of the K100s of any sort. You know, whatever you're talking about in the interior, whether it's dash or upholstery or trim or anything like that. I mean, if he wants to get in touch with me and ask me about specific parts, that'd be great. But there's not much available at all. So it's specifically to the bicentennials, all that upholstery would have to be custom reproduced.
All right. And I'm going to take my screen back here real quick if anybody has any other questions. Because I want to give a huge thank you to MHC, Mary Hoffman Company, for their support of this webinar and of ATHS. It was very much appreciated. And we will be having another webinar in December. And we will get some more information out about that. It's going to be a little different. It's going to be a little more interactive. So we hopefully we'll get that out to you here soon. David, I want to say a last minute thank you very much for all of your amazing work and hard work that you put into this. It was just
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. And hopefully you get to read some of the wonderful comments to you in the chat box.
Do I click on that?
Yes, just click on that and you can read those. And thank you to everybody who attended tonight and took some time out of your evening. We appreciate it. And I guess, morning to those few of you in Australia. We did have a few of you join us, so thank you for that. All right, guys, that is it for tonight. And we wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you on the other side. Bye.
Thank you.